Okay, hello everyone. Chag Chanukah Sameach. Good to see you here. Today we'll be talking about energies, a subject close to my heart, but also a subject that is a bit more abstract than some of the previous lectures when we were thinking about sizes. One could easily visualize what are sizes. Then we talked about concentrations. That's also something that's relatively easy to visualize. And now we're moving to energies, and anyone who finds a good way to visualize energy, please let me know. So we'll definitely be looking at number of ATP molecules. And I would also say that those that remember the paper from PNAS that you read before the second lecture, I think this would help you understand some of the things better here, the things you remember from there. Before we move on to energies, one thing relating to previous lecture, we were talking about concentrations and what are the most abundant proteins in different cells. And then I think the first one that was mentioned was Rubisco, the enzyme that does carbon fixation. I wanted to say that as a follow-up to some of the preparation and discussions in relation to that course, even though I usually say in lectures that this is the most abundant protein on Earth, because this is what I was taught and read. From working on this, I actually came to doubt this statement, so I'm not so sure anymore it's the most abundant protein on Earth. So that's the new sensation for the day. Anyone who wants to consider it further, try to speculate on what it is, you're welcome to do that, or come talk with me afterwards. I think there's actually some new stuff in that subject. The second thing is there were quite a few nice suggestions coming from the vignettes that you read and the things that you wrote about them. And I chose one of them to be presenting in the beginning of the class, just like last time. So Niv is welcome to come and present the calculation that he did.
Hi everybody, my name is Niv, and in the scope of students doing a back of the envelope calculation on the blackboard in front of everybody, I'm here today to talk with you about the calculation I did regarding spatial information density. So spatial information density, I'm not sure if you heard about it before, so let's define it. We will define it as the information content of an entity or a device divided by the volume it occupies in space. And regarding units, we would say that like the standard units for measuring information would be bits. And for volume, we could take any amount of volume, but I picked centimeter cube. That's like a typical volume of information storage devices that are handheld, like the one you encountered in your daily life. So that might sound a bit abstract, but let's start with an example. Maybe the most common information storage device these days, a USB. So let's try and calculate the spatial information density of a USB. So, ירוק לא טוב? שחור? חיפאי. Okay, so let's try to see what's the information density of a USB. So let's start with the volume. Now, if you go online and you look for typical volumes of a USB, you know, they make them like really tiny ones. They're so tiny that when they're inside the computer, you don't even know that they're in the drive. So like a typical volume would be something like 3 centimeter over 2 centimeter. Oh, let's do it like 1.5 over 0.2 centimeter. And we can say it's like roughly 1 centimeter cube. Okay, so we have the volume. That was easy. Now, regarding the information content of a USB, that's also rather easy because it's like written on the box. So if you go and you buy like a really good USB drive, it would be, I would say, like the really good ones would be 32 gigabytes. 32 gigabytes, but we said we're going to measure it in bits, so we need a little bit of unit conversion. So it would be like 32 times billion, which is like the giga. And we need the conversion factor of bytes to bits, which would be like approximately 8 bits per byte. And I didn't mention, but I'm sure everybody here in Weizmann knows, like a bit is like this funny digital entity of 0 or 1 that allow us to measure information, quantify information, and byte is just like a pack of 8 of these. So overall, we're going to get something like 256 billion bits. Okay, overall, we're going to get that the information density of a USB would be something like this. Centimeter cube. But I'm obviously not here to talk about USB drives. So let's try and do the same calculation for my favorite biological entity, actually my second favorite biological entity. And let's see if we can calculate the same thing for a virus. Okay, so what we want, again, we want the information over volume of a virus. So let's start with the volume of a virus. Since like winter is coming, the influenza virus is going to be like a good example. So the influenza virus has like, it's actually a spherical virus with a radius of approximately 50 nanometer. And we could, plug it in the formula for a sphere and calculate, but, just for the simplicity, let's assume it's a cubical virus, a new kind of cubical virus with a typical length of twice the radius. So it would be like 100 nanometer. And then the volume would be just like cubing it, which would give us 100 nanometer cubed, which would be something like this, times 10 to the minus 9 meter cube. And that would give us 10 to the power of minus 21 meters cube. And we could do some conversion factor of meter cube to centimeter cube, which is like a factor of million. So overall, we're going to get that the volume of this cubical virus is 10 to the minus 15 centimeter cube. Okay, so that was fairly easy as well. Now, the interesting part, how can we quantify the information content of a virus? So being a biologist, starting with the base pair is a good thing. And I can tell you that this virus has approximately 14,000 RNA bases per virus. The question is, how are we going to convert these biological bits or genetic bits into digital bits? And like a simple way to do it would be like to do like thinking about the number of binary digits that we need in order to represent these 4 biological bases, which would be just 2 bits per base. And it's very easy to convince you that it's true because I can write like a full exhaustive proof that we could just assign each base to a 2-digit binary number, and using 2 bits per base, I can cover all the biological bases. So we add like this conversion factor here of 2 bits per base, and we get that the information content of a virus would be approximately 28,000 bits. Now, that does not sound very impressive comparing to the 32 gigabytes of the USB, but let's see what does it mean regarding the information content of the virus. So we just plug in the numbers. It's going to be 28,000 bits divided by 10 to the minus 15 centimeter cube. And that would give us something like 28 to the power of 10 to the 18 bits per centimeter cube. Okay, so that's a really big number, and if you want to convert it to like standard storage units currently in use, we can convert it back to bytes, and we get something 3 exabytes, which is just 10 to the power of 18 bytes, approximately. Now, I'm sure that all of you have heard about like megabytes and gigabytes and terabytes and petabytes. I'm not sure how many of you encountered with exabytes. So a couple of things you could do with 3 exabytes of storage. You could store approximately 1,000 times all the photos in Facebook. Or you could store 1 week of global internet traffic, all the data packets that go throughout the internet, like in 1 week, would be approximately 3 exabytes. Or some would claim, I've seen an estimation that all the words ever spoken by human beings on Earth could be roughly summarized in 1 exabyte. So next time someone sneezes next to you, so the minimum you can do is appreciate the amount of information he's spreading around. Thank you very much, and good luck.
For Niv, for appreciation of viruses and how the numbers related to them are quite impressive. It's a good opportunity to remind you about the assignment for the course, in which you need to present something in front of the class. It could be a calculation of this, just like this, or the one Maya did last time, or it could be something else that you come up with, maybe some quiz or something else, as well as writing a vignette as a final assignment for the course. The vignette, which is like 2 or 3 pages with some quantitative aspect of biology, hopefully starting with some question of interest, could be related to what you want to present to class, or could be different. It's fine if they overlap, no problem with that. And I'll be happy to make it concrete by asking you, say in 2 weeks, so by the 16th of December, to send me the subject on which you want to do both things. Okay, so email it to the course email. If there are any questions, doubts, things you're not sure of, just feel free to contact either me or Uri, the TA of the course. Okay, now back to energies. And so we'll begin with a question, and that is, what is the characteristic power consumption of a human? Is it about 1 watt, 10 watts, 100 watts, or 1,000 watts? So don't shout the answer. We'll first make a vote. So who's voting for A, 1 watt, B, C, D? Okay, so what I suggest, I see there is more than like half and half here. I suggest take 5 minutes in pairs, trying to derive a strategy, or in this case, actually, I think you can try and actually do the calculation and see if you can get into a concrete answer. How do you approach it, and maybe even find out without using your iPhone, hopefully. I saw some good strategies and people started to calculate. Let's try and do it together. So what is the starting point for thinking about this question? Yeah, so the calories we consume, right? That's where the energy or the power comes from. So how many calories do you consume? 2,500, that's definitely the recommendation. I think the average American is heading towards the somewhat higher, but let's take 2,500, that should work well for us. So we have about 2,500 calories, or actually it's kilocalories, per day per person. Note, first of all, that I wrote it as, even though we call it calories, it's actually kilocalories, meaning thousands of calories. There's this funny thing about big calories and small calories. The usual physical calories are the small ones, and what we usually use in normal conversation is when we talk about calories are big calories, which are thousands of calories. Okay, so we're using about 2,500 kilocalories per day per person. Okay, so how do we convert it into something that refers to watts? So watts is a unit of power, and that's working in the usual MKS system, meaning you work with joules, etc. So you need to multiply that by the number of joules per kilocalorie or per regular calorie. So there's about 4 joules per calorie. And I'll just mention, going back, that the definition of a calorie comes from something relatively intuitive. That is, somebody remembers what's the definition of a calorie? So if you have like a gram of water, yeah, an ml of water, and around 25 degrees, but doesn't matter too much, if you ask about how much energy do I need to put into it in order to increase the temperature by 1 degree, that would be a calorie. Okay, and actually if one checks, it takes about 4 or 4.2 or whatever, depending on some fine details. So we have about what? So this is 2,500 times 4, that's 10,000, but this was, so it's 10 to the 4, but this is kilo, so we have 10 to the 7 joules per day. Okay, so this already could help us because if we're interested, this was energy. And now I'm interested in power. Now, notice that many times in these calculations, one could easily get confused, both in terms of units and other things, whether you're talking about total energy, just like the 2,500 calories, or if you're talking about power, which is per unit of time. Yeah, actually, you're right. Sorry, my mistake. Because I wrote here per day, this was already power. Thank you for that correction. So that was power. Good. 1 line less. If I was only writing 2,500 kcals per person, then it would have been total energy. Good. So now, in order to convert that into what we're interested in, the power, it might be useful for you. From the last week, we had this one-pager on tricks of the trade. If you want to move from that to the number of the power, you need to look at, you have 10 to the 7 joule per day. And you want to multiply it, converting between day and seconds. So 1 day is about how many seconds?
24 times 3,000.
Yeah, so we can always do it, no problem, 24 times 3,600, which comes to about 10 to the 5, which is a useful number to go with. And therefore, we have about 100 joules per second, that is 100 watts. Okay, so well done for all those who voted C, and those who voted B. That's also hopeful, I guess, for anyone who wants to decrease their calorie intake. So 100 watts, that's comparable to what? Let's try and think about it in other terms. So I see people pointing to the lamp. So a lamp is actually, how much is a lamp usually?
60.
Yeah, so the normal incandescent lights would be like 60 watts. So we're like 2 lamps if you want. But if you're looking at the more efficient lamps today, they're actually lower wattage, so we bought like 4 or 6 of those more efficient lamps. Okay, so that could also be expressed in, so this was for a normal human being under resting conditions. If you're doing, I don't know, like really strong physical exercise, you can increase that by, say, a factor of 2 or so, sometimes even more. But this is also interesting to express it in 2 other ways. And one is you can think about it also, just like Niv was showing about the density of information, one could talk about the density of energy production or energy consumption. So that's the power divided by the mass. And that is about 1 watt per kilogram. Taking our characteristic person of 100 kilograms, you get about that. And that is actually, so one could ask about what happens with other animals of different sizes. And actually, there is a strong debate about how this scales, how the power consumption, the metabolic requirements scale with size. There's this power, 1/4 power that is being indicated. On the other hand, there are other measurements that show that this is actually quite constant. So I would say that because the power in any way is not very strong, this is a good number to carry in your head about the amount of power that is usually required by many, many orders of magnitude of living organisms. Yes?
Has anyone ever plotted, to your knowledge, power density per species and average longevity?
Okay, so the question was, did people look at the relationship between the power consumption of different species and the longevity of different species? And the answer is yes, people have looked at it. There are nice, nice papers. All these scalings, people were doing that to the, to the ratio, to the size of the brain, to the amount of hours different species sleep at night, to the size of the heart, to the heart rate, as well as longevity. And one could look at that. It's an interesting subject. Okay. One other thing you might notice is that another way to represent how much power do we actually consume, because this is what we consume throughout the day. And we have about, so this is 2,500, is about 3,600 seconds in an hour. One could also show that this is equivalent, whenever you want to play around with units, is about 1 calorie or 1 big calorie per kilogram per hour. So you need about 1 calorie for every kilogram in your body per hour. That's roughly the usage. And you can see the relation between this and that, because there's about 3,600 seconds per hour. One could also think about this 100 watts in relation to a different unit of energy. That's the horsepower. That's how we often refer to our cars and things like that. Somebody knows how much is that?
Lifting 1 meter, 1 kilo, 1 meter high in the air in 1 second.
Right. So you can define it through the acceleration of a mass. And in terms of watts, that's about somewhere between 700 and 800 watts. So you need 8 people, normal metabolic consumption, in order to give you 1 horsepower. And actually, one could check and see that in cars you often have 10s or maybe 100 horsepowers. And then actually, if you measure what a horse can do, it could often do several horsepowers. It's just more of a historical note on what was chosen for the horsepower unit. Okay, questions about this? So I'd like to take this information about the energy that is required in order to run us as people, and now look at what it actually means in terms of the land required in order to supply that energy. So how much land is needed to supply the food. That will give us 100 watts. While you're considering that, let me just mention a few more facts about the, so we said that the power consumption of a human being is about 100 watts. Then you could look, say, in the Western world, in the developed world, how much electricity is being consumed by a person in terms of power. Anyone knows something about that? So that's about 1 kilowatt, 1,000 watts. That's on the average how much power consumption is being used. So that is about we're using in electricity about an order of magnitude more than we're consuming in terms of our metabolic rate. And then if you look at the total energy consumption, not just electricity, so in order to produce electricity, you have to do it in power plants with an average efficiency of, say, between 30 and 40%. So you need to multiply this 1 kilowatt by a factor of 3 in terms of the crude energy that you have to put into there, say in the form of coal or natural gas or whatever. And then there's also the electricity and the oil you burn, and that brings it to about 5 kilowatts of power that the average person is using in the developed world. So about 50 times more, almost 2 orders of magnitude more than our actual metabolic consumption.
And this is just electricity?
So this is now electricity together with transport. This is in production of this electricity as well as the transportation. So that's the 5 kilowatts. That's a good number for our total energy consumption. And the electricity is what takes, so the largest fraction of electricity is being used for what? So say the Weizmann Institute, like many other universities and research institutes, about 60% of the electricity is being used in order to heat and cool our buildings. And that's a quite characteristic number worldwide. So the vast majority of that energy goes into heating and cooling, a good reason why to keep your thermostats at a good temperature. Okay, so we go back to this. How do we go about trying to estimate how much land is required in order to supply our food? Where would you start in terms of thinking about of this sort of calculation?
Can you look at two things? How much kilograms of fruit you can get out of a tree and the space.
Good. So we want to take, in order to get to the land, we probably need something about the yield that we're going to get out of some area. And the energy originally comes from what? Comes from the sun. So a good first step would be about thinking, in the end, you need to get 100 watts. Let's start from what we're getting from the sun and then see how it's being converted by agriculture into utilizable energy. So how much energy is coming from the sun? Don't shout the answer. Let's try and see if our ability to estimate works here. So those who know exactly the number, doesn't seem to be a problem. Don't say. I'm just looking for all sorts of guesses or estimates on how much watts am I getting per square meter. And we'll try to do it in the democratic manner that we did last time. So just we'll collect all sorts of numbers here. You're welcome to start throwing out your guesses.
Is this per square meter?
Yeah, per square meter, when the sun is above you, how much energy is coming? Yeah.
5,000.
Okay, I have 5,000. That's watts per meter squared.
I'd go for 10 to the 9.
10 to the 9. Okay. Give me more. 10 to the 6. Okay, so it's actually, it's hard to put your hands on it, right? Okay, that's part of what I was saying, that energies are quite abstract. It's actually tough to work with. So we don't have such a strong intuition on it. So let's try and approach it in a different way. You remember we were talking about light bulbs, right? So, and we said something about light bulbs. So let's try and think about it not in terms of watts per square meter. Let's think about it in terms of light bulbs per square meter. Okay? If you think about the light or the energy that comes into a square meter from the sun being above, how many light bulbs? So we changed the units. Now we're not talking about watts per square meter. We're talking about light bulbs per square meter. What would you estimate? I have 20. I have 100. Anyone else? How do you feel about your light bulbs versus being in the sun? 1,000. Per square meter. Okay, last call. Any more guesses? Right. So now, remember from last time, when we're trying to do an estimate on that, we have two options. The naive democratic way of just taking the average over all those numbers, right? That would bring us to about, I guess, something like 600. This new unit, which looks like pound, but actually it's light bulbs per meter square. And then we could take it, say, in log scale, which I didn't do exactly, so that's 10 to the 2, 10 to the 3, that's closer to 10 to the 1. So that would bring me to roughly 100 light bulbs per meter squared. And the actual value outside the atmosphere is about 1,200 watts per meter squared, and it goes down to about 1,000 at sea level. So that's about, I guess, around, whoever said 20 light bulbs was actually dead on. But we see some of the advantages of taking the average on the geometric scale, and also doing the conversion, trying to find something else that you can connect to that is more intuitive to you than just trying to play around with numbers without having any foothold to start with. Okay, so a good number to work with is about 10 to the 3 watts per meter squared. That's what you're starting with in photosynthesis. Okay, questions about that? Okay, what do we want to do next?
Efficiency of energy transfer.
Okay, so now we have the issue of what's the efficiency of conversion between what? Between basically energy of photons and where do we get our calories from? Biomass or carbohydrates. So in the end, for humanity, about 80% of the calories come from grains. So that's corn, rice, wheat. That already covers the vast majority of the calories that we're getting. Then you have some in potatoes, in bananas, and other things. But grains are by far the largest contributors in terms of calories, both in eating them basically as is or eating them as high fructose corn sugar or whatever way you like eating your corn. In the end, it's usually coming from grains. So in talking about the energy or the efficiency of moving from here to here, there's a lot of steps involved here, and actually that's enough for a whole lecture or 2 lectures in the course about the steps happening in photosynthesis. So we won't get into all of them. I'll just say that overall, this conversion has to take into account different steps of happening. So what is involved in here? You're starting from photons in the sun. They have to be absorbed and excite these pigments called chlorophylls. So even though the absorption is happening at a very high efficiency, like this fantastic quantum machine, in terms of physics, lots of the wavelengths could not be utilized because they're, say, in the infrared, so you're losing like half of your energy there. Then when you're exciting the chlorophyll, part of the energy is actually being utilized in what's known as photochemistry. Then you're producing it from ATP and reducing power. You have quite a loss involved in that. There's other biochemical steps. There's often a problem of called photoinhibition, the fact that you're getting from the sun a lot of photons and you don't have the capacity to utilize all of them. Then there's the issue of how much of that energy that's being absorbed is actually being respired afterwards by the plant in order to take care of its own livelihood in the field. And then finally, there's a fraction of it coming into grains out of the whole biomass. Okay? So I'm not getting into all of those steps. I could tell you this is happening at roughly 1% or 0.5% in normal agricultural, quite efficient practices. Anyone who wants to get more information about it, I'll be happy to send you some good reviews on that. But this is a good estimate of what you're getting in the conversion. And then I would also say this actually shows something about the potential of being able to get more from a given parcel of land with better breeding, with better techniques of trying to deal with the agricultural productivity. So we have about 0.5% of efficiency. And this 1,000 watts per square meter, yeah?
About that last point about the difference in efficiencies, that's one number. Do we have
A range?
A range?
Yes. So there is a range. It could go up to, the most efficient fields in some specific locations could be like 1%, or under a fraction of the under duration of just the most productive time of the year, it could be higher. In many other cases, in many places where agriculture is not as efficient, it goes below that. So this is some characteristic global value one could use. This 1,000 watts per square meter, before I'm going ahead and multiplying this, I have a problem with that. Anyone sees some issue with using that number? What?
Not utilizable energies?
Utilizable energies. OK, so that's a good point. But actually, that was already included here in thinking about this efficiency. What? I see. What? Yeah, so it's something related to something with so when thinking about the watts per square meter, that's per unit area, that's fine. That was when the sun was shining above you, right? But now there's all sorts of issues with that. Usually, it's not that you're getting from every meter all the time 1,000 watts. There's night and day. So you're losing, say, half. Then there's the angle at which it arrives, which then means that it crosses over a larger area. Then there's clouds that, this, except for giving us our food, this drives all of the cycles on the earth, right? That gives us the wind and this and that, the climate cycle. So when one could start averaging, mostly let's take into account the light-day cycle, day-night cycle, as well as the angle at which it hits. So everything over these and the different latitudes on the global scale, that would be converted to about 200 watts per square meter. That's now, so like moving from what happens when the sun is just above you to what happens globally on the average. OK, so now we could look now at the density of power per unit area that we're getting through agriculture. So you're having, in terms of light hitting on the average, about 200 watts per meter square. And that's multiplied by 0.5%, which is giving us on the order of 1 watt per square meter. But this watt is quite different from the original watt that we started with. This is a watt in food. Okay, which can now take us back to asking the question of how much land do we require. So the power required by a human, we just said, is about 100 watts. And therefore, the area per person is about 100 meters squared, right? 100 watts divided by 100 watts per square meter, giving you 100 meters squared. Any, what?
You could do things
can you do things in layers? You're saying maybe we could use say we have a given dunam, like a square, 1,000 square meters. Can we maybe make the fields one on top of the other?
Because of the angle and all that, I think increasing.
Okay. There's all sorts of limitations because of how much photons you'll actually be getting at each layer, and also building like, a whole valley in layers. That's also an economical issue, but one could consider that. And there's all sorts of interesting things in the urban area that people are trying to do such, green roofs and things in such creative ways.
We could do it if we start using microalgae.
Okay, so that's one option, maybe in microalgae. So this is being considered as a way in order to help us get at higher efficiencies than this. Actually, it was an issue, it was a suggestion in the 60s when there were clear projections on the increase in human population following World War II and the increase in life expectancy. It was quite clear there's going to be a problem of food production. And then there was suggestion of using microalgae both for food per se as well as for protein production. What changed the prospects then is two things. One is that people did not like the taste of the microalgae on the one hand. And on the other hand is what happened? The Green Revolution. So the Green Revolution was this way of basically tripling the yields per unit area, meaning that the value that we're putting here, that's after the Green Revolution. Before the Green Revolution, it was about 3 times less. So this was, I think, one of the most impressive achievements of, if you look at what biology achieved for humanity, or let's say even the science of biology achieved for humanity, that's one of the most impressive things, and came from the Green Revolution and from combination of breeding as well as fertilization, etc. So that's apropos, yeah.
So what is still missing for me, like to comprehend the amount of land that I need to sustain me throughout all my life, is to take the actual energy we need, not only in food, and also this is, it's in what, our consumption is in what, so it's calories per second, and in this, like we're talking about land producing energy per second, but like to take this and now understand the amount of land that a person needs to sustain
Excellent.
all the aspects of its being
Excellent.
throughout its whole life.
Excellent.
That's obviously not this 100 square meters.
Okay, so you're saying this was talking specifically about food, and there's many, many other things we're using and that have to be taken into account.
And also
So,
the field is not like throughout my life producing the energy. Because
okay, so hopefully if things are being done in a sustainable way, what we were doing here is about, it doesn't matter on what time scale you're analyzing it. If you're analyzing it for a day or for a year or for 10 years, what we were calculating is the amount of land that its production, if used in a sustainable manner, would be supplying the grains that you need. It's a bit also, that's something that's often not so very intuitive when looking at power versus energy, but we were doing here in terms of the land that its yield is similar to what you'll be consuming. In terms of analyzing many other things, like for example, what would happen in terms of our energy production in other terms, and what could be needed in terms of land in order to perform the carbon fixation, in order to sequester that CO2 from being in the atmosphere, or if you're looking at the land that is required in order to produce your cotton for your clothes, or if you're looking at things required for the wood for the furniture, etc. So all of that is being done through a fantastic approach called ecological footprint. And it's highly recommended to check. They're doing really impressive analysis on that. Okay, now what I want to just say before that, to complete that, this 100 watts per square meter is still somewhat of an underestimate because of 2 main factors, at least. One is the fact of the amount of loss that we're having. This was if everything was perfectly efficient in terms of every grain that comes out in the field is then being eaten, and actually more than half is today being lost in the process, much of it through overproduction of food that then is being thrown away in one way or another, and also other inefficiencies. So actually, this should be increased by at least a factor of 2 because of that. And the other is that a significant fraction of the calories that we're eating in the form of animal products, yeah, so beef, dairy, pork, poultry, etc. And then the efficiency, so they're not working with the same calories. They're eating these calories that are being produced. And then there's another stage in the trophic levels, another conversion going from what they eat into the calories that we'll be eating further on. And that could be quite inefficient. Anyone who wants to know exactly the numbers, so Alon Chapon here is doing his research work on trying to quantify specifically that. For beef, it's the most extreme in terms of being inefficient and could add quite a factor. And in general, I would say that from this 100 meter, because of these two factors together, a more realistic value is towards 1,000 meters squared per person. So about an order of magnitude more. Yeah.
So how many people can the Earth hold?
Okay, so how many people could the Earth support? So let's try and think about it. We have about 1,000 meters squared. That's the amount required per person, right? So how many people do we have on Earth? So we have about 7 billion. Let's say 10 to the 7. Excuse me, 10 to the 10. So that means that we require about, so 10 to the 10 times 10 to the 3, about 10 to the 13 meters squared. So that's about 10 million kilometers squared. 10 million kilometers squared, that's about the size of the United States. And okay, is this conversion clear? Here I was just playing between meter square and kilometer square. There's 1,000, so 10 to the 6. So from 10 to the 13, it went to 10 to the 7. And actually, if you look at the arable land used by humanity on Earth, that's somewhere between 10 and 20 million kilometers. So we're within a factor of 2. That's the arable land used for crops. And then you can ask yourself, what is the potential if you cut down all the trees everywhere and just do it for agriculture? And I don't want even to consider that. But we're already using most of the land that's fit for agriculture, that we're willing to consider turning into agriculture, into doing that, which means that if we want to increase the amount of consumption, we have to find solutions in order to deal with that. Okay, I know there's, okay, one last question about that, and then we move on.
What about stuff that doesn't require light? You know, grows in caves, sulfur dependent.
Okay, so a question about what can be said about things that do not require light. So I would say that the efficiencies of that and the amount of productivity you can get from such thing is quite limited as far as I know. So in the end, being based on what you can get from the sun is probably the best strategy. But if you have another good idea, that could be a wonderful grant or a subject of research. Or try to even analyze how much can you expect to get from that. Okay. So let's going from the perspective of the whole organism or the whole planet, now we'll try to focus on what it means at the level of the cell. So we'll try to look at how much ATP is consumed per cell. So we already know what to start with. If we're, say, analyzing it for a human cell, how much energy how much power does it consume? We just said about 100 watts. And then we know that if we're thinking about, let's think about characteristic cells of a human of the size of about 1,000 micrometer cubed. So we already did that in one of the exercises, right? I think for after the first lecture, and there's about 10 to the 14 cells if you're taking that side. Okay, the exact number of cells is still disputed. It's probably somewhat lower than that, about 3 times 10 to the 13. Anyone who wants to know more about it, Ron Sender here is doing research on that. But this could be a good approximation if we just if we talk about this characteristic cell size. So this means that we have 10 to the 2, 10 to the 14. That's 10 to the minus 12 watts per cell. And I should have said here human cell. Okay, this was like a human mammalian cell. Okay, but now I'd like to know something about how much ATP does it require. What do we need to know in order to do that? So we need to know something of watts per ATP. So what happens in ATP? ATP is getting hydrolyzed by water to give us ADP plus PI. And this runs very strongly in this direction, and this serves as the energy currency for doing most of the process we're interested in. And the way to quantify the energy being released is this thing that you probably saw in your undergrad, and that is the delta G, or the delta G of that reaction, which is roughly for ATP about 50 kilojoule per mole. So here there's quite a lot to be said about, so I'll just say a few comments about that and we'll move on. This delta G is something that depends on concentrations. It's not one number that is always the same. There is this thing called delta G0. That is what happened under this thing called standard conditions. But we don't need to get into all of those details right now. But it's important for me to just stress that this value, excuse me, there's a minus here. The values there depend on the concentrations being used. And then you might remember, what is delta G? Delta G is like the change in the Gibbs energy. And Gibbs energy, that's going back to thermodynamics and all sorts of considerations relating to that. What is important to know that actually, if anyone wants to really understand deeply what happens there, there's all these things about enthalpy and entropy and all the dynamics of these things. In the end, it all relates to even only one simple general principle, and that is the fact that the entropy of the world always increases, and this quantifies by how much. If one wants to, and the reason why the entropy of the world increases could be thought about a very statistical, simple way, but it's not as simple as me being able to explain it right now. If anyone wants to understand it more, there's a wonderful book that really helped me understand it very, very clearly, and a relatively accessible one. It's by Ken Dill. And it's called Molecular Driving Forces. So, molecular. So, if anyone is going on some vacation and has to take some science book with him, with her, that would be my recommendation. Okay, what can you do? What can you do with these numbers? There's also a lot to be said here, but I just want to give you one rule of thumb in terms of what could be done with kilojoules per mole. And the rule of thumb, you also have it in your tricks of the trade, is the following. 6 kilojoules per mole is equivalent to 1 order of magnitude difference in concentrations. Okay, so what do I mean by this? I mean that if you have 6 kilojoules per mole, you can drive processes that were originally in equilibrium, meaning to say you have a membrane and things on both sides, or you have some enzymatic reaction, let's say going from glucose through glycolysis down into the products, or you want to run it in the reverse. For every 6 kilojoules per mole, you can drive it out of equilibrium by an order of magnitude in terms of the concentration of your products to your substrates. And therefore, if you have 50 kilojoules per mole, that's really quite a lot, because as you can tell, that's like 8 times more than that. So it's like 8 orders of magnitude. That's a huge amount of imbalance that you can create between your products and your substrates. That's why ATP, at least in the concentration that usually happen physiologically, is a very potent energy currency, being able to drive things out of equilibrium very strongly. There's a lot more to be said about it. I know it's quite abstract. Anyone who wants to know a bit more about it, either read in the book, or I can send you some other stuff, or write an assignment on the subject, etc. Yeah.
Talking about taking an order of magnitude in the concentration per mole, like changing concentration in a mole substance or in a volume, or what do you mean this change?
Yeah.
So do it in a huge volume, you need more energy.
Okay, so this is what is required in order to transfer a molecule or a mole. You can think about it as per mole if you have, say, like a compartment between the inside and the outside of the cell, or the outside and the inside of the cell. That could be one way of thinking about it. Okay, so that was an aside about what does it mean, this delta G of 50 kilojoule per mole. But now what I wanted to do is go from the number that was quite clear to us, the watts per cell, that was relatively intuitive, and that would enable us to go into the number of ATP that hopefully also would be somewhat intuitive. So we already know what ATP does. So in order to get at the number of ATPs, I need to take the amount of energy that I have, 10 to the minus 12 watts. Just a second, I forgot something. Excuse me 1 second. There was actually a question that would help us do that, and that is saying how much energy is in ATP hydrolysis. And we said there's about 50 kilojoule per mole. And I'd like to convert it into the amount of power that I'm getting, amount of energy that I'm getting per molecule. So for that, I'd like to get kilojoule per ATP, not per mole of ATP. Okay? So what do I need to do? I need to, again, to multiply by 1 mole divided by the Avogadro number. ATPs. Okay, I'm just doing the unit conversion. So 5 and 6, that would cancel. And this is 1,000, so that's like 5 times 10 to the 4 joules, divided by 6 times 10 to the 23. This would cancel, and I have 10 to the minus 19. And what would be my units? I had mole and mole, joules per ATP. Okay, this is what I needed. This tells me from having 1 ATP and I hydrolyze it, how much energy am I going to get out of it, which would be quite handy now, because now I want to know the number of ATPs that can be involved in giving me the 10 to the minus 12 watts per cell. Okay? So number of ATPs per unit time is what? 10 to the minus 12 watts per cell divided by 10 to the minus 19 joules per ATP. Now, why did I write unit time? Because this was in units of watts, meaning that's like joule per second. Okay, 10 to the minus 12 joules per second per cell divided by 10 to the minus 19 joules per ATP. Minus 12 and minus 19, that's 10 to the 7. Joules falls off with joules. That's ATP per second per cell, per human cell. Yes?
Concerns about this calculation. One is that if you take a 100 kilo man, 50 kilos are extracellular water, and you spend energy on keeping them above the ambient temperature. So it's 50 kilos warm by 10 degrees constantly. And the other is that you have 10 to the 14 E. coli cells, bacterial cells.
Okay, so this is talking about averaging over the whole body. It's true that a large fraction of that is water, but what is a large fraction of it is within cells, and this is just assuming that everything is with the cells and an average number. So it's true that for a specific cell, say cell type, or when you remove any fraction of the water, the value could change by, say, 2-fold, 3-fold, etc. The second point about the bacterial cells, so that's actually an interesting project to try and estimate what fraction of the energy production, the 100 watts that a person produces, what fraction of it comes out of the bacterial cells in our body. Even though they're very numerous, and you calculate it's about an order of magnitude or 2 more than the number of human cells, in terms of volume or mass, they're actually just a few percent. And I would say that to first approximation, they're also a few percent of the energy production. Thanks for that. Okay, so we got here, which means that we using a normal, an average human cell would use about 10 million ATPs per second. Or I think a good scale for thinking about human cells is not about seconds, but rather thinking in terms of days. There's something strange here. Okay, is thinking in terms of not per second, but when we think about a cell cycle of a human cell dividing happily is about a day. So I'd like to convert it per day. So what do I need to multiply by? Exactly the same 10 to the 5 that we used before. So the numbers come back to us. So it's about 10 to the 12 ATP per day per cell. So that's a characteristic number in terms of your budget as a human cell when you have to replicate yourself or go throughout your daily life. How many ATPs can you spend? I would say that there's actually another complication here that we didn't talk about. We did this based on an estimation of saying if the whole 100 watts were coming solely from ATP hydrolysis, where in fact in that sense it's a liberal estimate. The value would actually be quite lower because in order to have the ATP you also need to produce the ATP, say from the glucose or whatever you started with in terms of your food you ate, and therefore there's a lot of heat being produced there that is not coming directly from producing ATP. That also goes back to Shai's question that was saying about all sorts of things that we use energy in order to keep our energy budget in terms of keeping our heat. So this is somewhat of a liberal estimate. It might be a few fold smaller, but in terms of order of magnitude, that's something we could use, and you saw the steps leading to that. Now I'd like to move into a specific usage of that number. Before that,
I'm just curious, what does it mean regarding the average turnover number of ATPs in a cell? Like you need to hydrolyze like 10 million every second? And like how many do you have in a cell?
Nice. Okay, so we're scooping our next lecture about durations and rates, but let's go in that direction just to see if we could connect the dots. So we said that the average cell uses 10 to the 7 ATPs per second per cell, right? So if I understood Niv's question correctly, he says, let's think about how many ATPs are in a cell, and therefore, if it's consuming that, what is the turnover time? Is that clear? Okay, so let's see how well did we deal with following concentrations in last time. What would be a characteristic concentration of ATP inside a cell? So about, would it be a micromolar, a millimolar, a molar, a nanomolar? About a millimolar, right? So we're talking about like a metabolite like that would be on the order of a millimolar in the cell. Okay, what did we say about a rule of thumb in terms of converting from concentration into absolute numbers? Yeah, exactly. So 1 nanomolar in a bacterial volume is 1 molecule. Okay, so but we're not talking about 1 nanomolar. We're talking about 1 millimolar. So that's how many orders of magnitude? That's 6 orders of magnitude more. So we're talking about 1,000,000 if it's a millimolar. But we're talking about a mammalian cell, which is 3 orders of magnitude higher, right? So that's not 10 to the 6, but 10 to the 9 molecules, right? So we have about 10 to the 9 ATP molecules in the cell. So if we're using 10 to the 7 of them, it means that we're turning them over at what rate? Every how long? Every 100 seconds. Okay, so every 2 minutes, we're turning over our ATP consumption according to that calculation.
Where are the measured metabolic rates? I mean, you have a range, right, between your class and
Yeah, so there's definitely a big range, and that we'll get to that maybe when we'll finish something here. Okay, I hope that connected in some way what you can do if you know something is about concentrations, if you can think about these things in a connected way. Okay, so we got into roughly this value. And I want to use that for a specific example. Or just before that, let's think about this. So this is the budget that the average cell in your body has to use. What do you think it's spending it over? What are the main processes? Let's try and make a list of different processes on which it could spend this amount of energy. Thinking. Okay, well, let's say more at the molecular level. What would it convert to? Okay, so I have proteins. What is meant by proteins? Okay, expression. Synthesis of proteins. We had membrane potential, I heard. Movement, so actin, polymerization, signaling, trafficking, DNA synthesis, sarcomers, so that's like in the muscles, right? Contraction. Okay, so I would suggest that it could be interesting to take each one of these and try to actually put a number behind it to try and see how it compares to the budget of the body as a whole or a specific cell type. Yes?
do you have any numbers as to the efficiency? So if you were to sum over all this, how much smaller would it be than
Yeah, so there's also an interesting question about the efficiencies. There's lots of heterogeneity there. And if you want, I can afterwards give you some numbers in relation to that. But for now, I want to take one of those and try to analyze that, see how can you connect that. And that is, let's try and put it as a question. If you took the average human cell and it spent all of its energy only on what? Let's take it on the first step, on the first thing mentioned here, all of its energy on protein synthesis or turnover. What would the average turnover be? So would it be, say, a few minutes, or a few hours, or a few days, or a few weeks? Is the question clear?
Like the turnover of all proteins in the cell?
Yeah, the turnover of all the proteins in the cell. So we're talking about average. So it might be that some are turning over quite quickly, quite rapidly. Some are turning over quite slowly. It might be that some cells in our body are turning over slowly, some quickly. If we just took the average, assuming that all of the energy used by the human body is used only for that process, what would be the characteristic scale on that?
Turnover of one protein or of all the proteome?
All the proteome. So you're using all of your energy only for turning over your proteome, forgetting about all the other processes being involved.
You're assuming that the cell continues to produce energy all the time.
Yeah, so it produces energy which is being used only for turning over proteins. Yeah?
We can look at it not on the energy scale, but it takes a few weeks to eat your entire weight, and assuming that all goes into turnover.
That's an interesting approach. So you're saying maybe we could connect it to how long does it take us in order to eat the food that we're consuming. That's interesting, although I would say it's a question whether it's the energy content is the relevant thing, because there's the energy content you're getting from the food that you're eating, and there's a different number, it's the energy content of just turning over the proteins inside. It's an interesting connection. One could see what would come out if you try that. So we'll be doing a quick vote on that. Who's in favor for a few minutes? Okay. Who's in favor for a few hours? Few days? Few weeks? Good. So we have some spread. Let's try and see how we could actually estimate that. So we have to think about what happens in protein synthesis. And the most energetic process in that is the step of polymerization of two amino acids together in order to give you the peptide bond. In order to do that, it takes roughly about 4 phosphate bonds per amino acid polymerization. Why does it take these 4 phosphate bonds, or 4 ATPs if you wish? That's because on the first stage, you have to load an amino acid into the tRNA done by the synthetase that actually converts an ATP into AMP, monophosphate. So that's like you hydrolyze like 2 phosphate bonds. So you lost 2. And then you have to take that and then bind it to the ribosome. That turns a GTP into a GDP. So that's equivalent to another ATP. And then the last step, which I don't even remember right now. Oh, it's a translocation of the ribosome that also requires one GTP to GDP, so that's equivalent to another ATP. As you can see, I wrote, because I don't want to write ATP, because these are not necessarily ATP, it's just these phosphate bonds. So I'm writing it in this form, but it's equivalent to saying 4 ATPs. That's per amino acid. So what would it take now to turn over all of our proteins? That's now not so hard for us to do. If we could do it in different ways, we need to know something about the number of proteins that we have inside the cell. So we could derive it in different ways, but it would be easiest for me if you just remember what we already derived, I think, in the first lesson. Anyone remember something about the number of proteins per volume? Right, so we had it that way. So, right, so if we looked at the bacterial cell, which is good for us to carry on with, because that's a micron cube, there was about 3 million, 3 times 10 to the 6 proteins per micrometer cubed. Now we're talking about a human cell that we chose as being about 1,000 micrometer cubed, which would give us, that's per human cell. By the way, it's a relatively small human cell. The average human cell would be 2,000 or 3,000. But so this would bring us about 3 times 10 to the 9 proteins. But I'm interested not just in the proteins, I want to polymerize the amino acids, right? So how many polymerization would have to be taken place?
Yeah, we have about 300.
Right, so I have about 3 times 10 to the 9 proteins. And I need to multiply by about, say, 300 amino acids per protein. So that gives me about 10 to the 12 amino acids per cell. Okay? So how much energy do I need to invest in that? I need to multiply by roughly 4. So it's about 4 times 10 to the 12 ATP per cell, proteome. Now it's really too bad that I deleted what we had here, so I can remind you, or you can check me. It was, I think, about 10 to the 12 ATP per day per human cell. So now I can find a time scale that would be tau, which would be just dividing the amount of ATP that I need, 4 times 10 to the 12, divided by 10 to the 12. So this is what? This is, let's look at the units. This is ATP per cell, divided by 10 to the 12 ATP per day per cell. ATP and ATP, cell and cell. So I have about 4 days. The collected budget of about 4 days of the average cell is required in order to turn over or synthesize just the amino acids in the proteome. So this gives us a lower bound on how quickly can I turn over if this is the amount of ATP that I have. And as I said, this is actually, this is quite a liberal estimate. The value probably on the average needs to be higher because of both the fact that I'm not investing all of my energy just in this process. There's also other processes. And the fact that, as I was saying before, it's not that you're producing ATP in 100% from your 100 watts of power. You actually have to do some efficiency of conversion into ATP. So I would say that, so this would suggest something like few days. And if you take those other things into account, it might be somewhere between few days or maybe even few weeks. In general, it shows how much, to what extent is ATP, is a protein turnover quite expensive for the cell. At the same time, I would say that if you look at the heterogeneity within our cells, so there are measurements of, say, cell lines like the ones you study in the lab of HeLa cells that could turn over the proteome on the order of a day or 2 days. And that is because there are cells that actually do not need to turn over the proteins at all. For example, in our red blood cells, hemoglobin there it's being produced once and just stays there functioning for the whole lifetime of the red blood cell, 120 days or whatever it is exactly. And say, in collagen could be quite stable. Other things could be very stable, and they could make a large fraction of the biomass or your protein content. And then there are some other cells which would require much faster turnover. But on the average, you can see how we got from that a relatively slow turnover time. Yes?
I don't know, something, my intuition is probably wrong, or I missed something. But I know that the proteins in our cells are usually the turnover time from the synthesis to the degradation. Okay, I can define this as turnover.
Mm-hmm.
It's somewhere with some proteins have a turnover of minutes, some hours, and some days. So let's say that the protein turnover is within a few hours in general average. And the cells don't put all the energy that they have in protein synthesis.
Okay,
If they
so
have more energy, then the turnover should be smaller, not bigger, if I understand correctly.
okay, so what I
If we have much more energy, we can produce all the time, and then we can degrade all the time, so the turnover will be.
wonderful. So it seems like we have a paradox here. You're saying what you know from your literature or from your research is that it's supposed to be much faster. Okay, so you have a wonderful subject for a project to try and see how you can reconcile these two things. Okay, I'm not sure about what's exactly the answer. I did some straight math here and analysis, and you can try and see which one of the assumptions or the steps in the calculation you think might be wrong, and I'll be happy to hear what you find out.
Maybe it's because of
Okay, I actually don't want to get into it. We don't have a lot of time, and actually there's a whole discussion that could open up here. Enlighten us whenever you get some answer. Okay, let's finish up by just seeing what, from those different steps that you pointed out, just a few values that are known from the literature, and we'll go back to our Hanukkah celebration. So I tried to collect some examples of what is known for different cell types. So I think the first thing that was mentioned here was about thinking. So what is thinking in terms of energy? Where does the energy go to? So if we think about the brain. So the brain, by the way, you might know, is something that in terms of mass is not that large even in humans, but in terms of energy production, energy consumption is about 20 to 30% of our energy consumption. And within the brain, 50 to 60%, that's at least the estimate that I could find, goes into the, anyone knows what molecular process would be sitting here? What enzyme?
Keeping the ratio of the different.
Exactly. So that would go to the NAK ATPase that is in charge of pumping the ions so as to create the imbalance, kind of like the delta G, if you like, of the free energy, changing difference in concentrations, giving you out of equilibrium, that enables you to do the firing of the neurons in order to do what we call thinking. Okay, so the largest fraction of that budget goes into this. What else could be of interest? Let's think about the heart. So what would it be in the heart? So we're talking about mechanical contractions in order to run. So the value I could find on that. And it's an interesting subject on how are these things measured, but I won't get into it right now, but it's related often to looking at the oxygen consumption when you're stopping deliberately specific steps like specific motors or processes. So this goes into the actinomyosin ATPase. And the actinomyosin is, again, this is the process that gives you the mechanical contractions in order to enable the functioning of the heart. If you look at the liver, there's about 15 to 40% working on running gluconeogenesis. So this is often in charge of producing the glucose that would be used by many other cell types in order to burn that glucose to give you NAK ATPase, actinomyosin ATPase, etc. So gluconeogenesis is very big in the liver. And then the other thing is 25% goes into protein synthesis. The major process that we were just discussing. And then another quarter, roughly, goes into protein leakage.
How did you measure this?
And this is, just a second, this is a catch name for the process in which, after lots of energy is being wasted, if you like, by the fact that protons that have been pumped over the membrane are afterwards leaking, and that energy is not being utilized. Although I'm not sure actually what fraction of that should also take into account here, but we'll not get into it. How are these things measured? So what I do know is that there's different approaches to doing it. The most common one that I saw is about putting inhibitors that are able to stop specific processes and then seeing how the oxygen consumption changes. That's usually in perfused tissues that are being studied in the lab. So they have like perfused hearts and perfused livers of different organisms, usually like they're using a pig or a rat or a mouse, and seeing just the slow time after inhibiting things, how these things change. There could be all sorts of artifacts in getting into it, and therefore people have spent their life trying to check it from different directions, and I'm just giving the final answers on that. It would be interesting to see if there's other things found out there. Okay, I hope you'll have an energetic week until we meet next week. Thank you.